Hi, I'm back today to talk to you a little bit about cattle, livestock, ruminants, sheep, any animal honestly that lives on the grass. Some of these topics will apply to. In general, I'm just going to talk about cattle, but again, this is going to apply to our sheep, goats, and a lot of these principles. I'll do a video on poultry and fowl later, but a lot of these principles also apply to chickens and ducks and any sort of meat fowl. So again, I'm just going to be saying cattle, but this applies to really any animal that lives on the land, which is a lot of animals. If you hear something in the background, I have a space heater going because it is super sunny but windy and cold, and so I have that going to heat me up a little extra while I'm in here. So I want to talk about 3 different things today. I'm going to try to make this go fast and not go on too many tangents, but I'll probably do that, so I'm sorry. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is where they live and what they eat. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what I guess I'll call their life cycle or their lifestyle, but basically who they're living with and how they're living. And third, I want to talk about their one bad day, right? Their processing. So first I'll start with where they live and what they eat. These 2 things I can't really separate, so that's why they're one point together. So cattle, if you've ever seen a cow or a ruminant eat, they actually have very tough tongues and they don't bite like we do. So they aren't getting a piece of grass like this, okay? They are using their tongues, their long tongues that are really, really rough. They feel like a piece of sandpaper to wrap around a piece of grass and pull it. That means that the grass has to be pretty tall, right? If the grass is only this tall, they can't do that. And that's where you see them nibbling. And farmers that farm the way we do will kind of make fun of cattle that are eating like that, sadly, in a way, and call them carpet grazers because they can't really eat the way that they're meant to. You need a pretty big piece of grass, right? Or chunk of grass, ideally, for them to be able to eat in the way that they're supposed to. So again, they put their tongues around it and rip it out, bring it to their mouths, chew, chew, chew. Do that again and again and again. So you need tall grass for that to be able to work. And if they don't have tall grass, they're not eating the way that they're supposed to. And I do think that that matters, right? If they are, genetically created to eat that way, that is the way they're supposed to be eating. And that's the type of food they're supposed to be eating. They're not supposed to be eating short grass. Short grass does not have a lot of nutrition. It is quickly putting all of its nutrition back into the roots so that they can recover from being so short so that it can grow taller. So again, that grass just doesn't have a lot of nutrition. The bulk of nutrition is found in tall grass and sometimes like really tall grass, right? If you were to see a prairie that has not been cut, it literally, if you read the, what is that story? Little House on the Prairie books, the buffalo would roam, and after they would roam, right, they would kind of mow it down. But before, the grass would be so tall that it would be over your heads, and the mom was worried she was going to lose her kids in it. So that is the kind of grasses that we're talking about on the prairie that these ruminants, like cattle, bison, eat. Very, very tall grass. And the nutrition is found in the top portion of the grass because it's going to be sending all of its energy down into the roots if it's short, but if it's tall, all of that energy is up at the top to grow. If it's consistently cut down short, it again is trying to fix its roots, get them down deep again, and be able to grow up tall again and be able to put the nutrition back up to the top of the grass. I hope I kind of explained that. So when you have cattle who are eating short grass, first off, they're not eating the way that they're supposed to. Secondly, they're not eating very nutritious grass, which means your meat is not very nutritious. You want to be eating meat that has eaten tall grass, basically, has been able to eat it in the way that they're supposed to, and has also eaten grass that has the most chlorophyll in it, most nutrients for the cow. There's tons more information on that, and if you'd like to message me, I will have my husband send you all of it because I've heard his spiel millions of times. I've watched videos and read books, but I would just have him send you the links because he's into all that nerdy stuff, and I just am like, okay, I get it, and let's move on. So that's really important. So cattle are not designed to be eating hay year round. Hay is just dried grass. It does not have, I'm sorry, people are going to argue with me, but it doesn't have the same nutritional value as if it was fresh growing grass. That's kind of obvious, I think, if without the science, although you can look at the science and it says that too. If you're eating a fresh strawberry versus a dried strawberry, 2 totally different experiences there, right? The nutritive content is different. The water, everything in it is different. So that kind of goes in hand with first what they should be eating, right? Not just grass. They should not be eating grain. They're not designed to eat grain. And I'm going to step aside a little bit here. And I know in a lot of carnivore groups, which I'm very animal based, and I'm going to do some videos on eating, but I do believe that animals are what we should be eating. And I believe they are the most nutrient dense foods. And in an era right now where most of us are really malnourished from eating processed food that doesn't have a lot of nutrients, I think that we all need to be eating meat. I don't believe that grain-fed meat and grass-fed meat is on the same caliber. And we can argue that all day. I do believe that some sort of meat, so if you just need to buy the cheapest available grain-fed beef, that's totally fine. You should do that rather than not eating beef. But if you can wiggle your budget in whatever sort of way so that you are eating grass-fed beef, that animal has eaten in the way that its stomach is designed to process food. It would be like us trying to eat grass, which we do not have the rumen, we do not have the digestive enzymes to break down cellulose. We can't eat grass and survive all the time. Sure, you can eat a couple pieces of grass and not die, but you're not going to be eating just grass and get the nutrients that you need for your body to thrive. So in the same way, cattle cannot eat corn, which their bodies are not designed to break down starches like that, fats like that, and that's why it's sitting in their body in their meat. They're not designed to eat that way, and so they are not very healthy if that is all that they're eating. So I will leave that there. But again, the grass is really what they should be eating. Now, at the same time, living in higher grass is also how they should be living. Before we put fences up and started to have domesticated cattle, we had on our land bison, tons and tons of bison, and they live in herds, just like cattle like to live in herds. They would eat a certain area of grass, and again, they would not nibble it down. They would, kind of come through and take off the top bits of grass, eat that because it's the most nutritious for them. It's the easiest way for them to eat, and then move on, right? We need to be mimicking the same thing with our cattle. So most regenerative farms like us, they will have the outside of their property fenced in with a long-term fence, a permanent fence. And then within that, they will have temporary fences. So they will have either literally netted fences that you can move, or they'll have just wires that you can string around to create new paddocks. And they'll try to mimic that pattern of the cattle moving so often. In addition to giving them the best feed, right, that top part of the grass, what it also does is limit the pathogens. So if a cattle is living in bare dirt that they've eaten down so much, right, and maybe somebody comes and brings them more hay to eat, they only have a small place to live, then they are living in dirt and their poop goes right on there. And then they're going to be eating in and laying in their own poop and their friends' poop. That's where you start to worry about things like bacterial infections, parasites, all of that nasty stuff that we don't want to worry about in our food. That is the kind of scenario that is created where you will have that in your food because the cattle are living in those conditions that are ripe for that. And that applies to tons of different animals. So you want cattle who are dropping their fertility, their manure, on a space, but then moving on. You don't want them on it for a couple days where they trample down all the grass. It's now bare dirt and they're sitting in their poop. I want to add here that no farm is doing things exactly how they like. I think it is just the personality of farmers that they constantly are improving and doing their best. But I don't want to be judgmental here because sometimes you have scenarios that you can't control. We have different water, I'll say hydrant spouts throughout the property that we move water to for our cattle as they're in different paddocks. However, they may be using a water spot for a long period of time, especially in the winter. So they will trample that area pretty good. If any water gets spilled, it's really rainy. If they're just there for a couple hours, it gets trampled down to mud. So we can't totally prevent that, even though we try to move the water around as much as we can. So it's not perfect, and I'm not saying it needs to be perfect, but it isn't the ideal, right? They aren't living in those conditions all the time. They're not fenced into mud all the time. For us, it's just around their water sometimes. So I just want to add that in there. But they really need to be moving on to fresh pasture, not just for food, but also as a clean place for them to live and to bed down, so they are not just sitting in their excrement and completely covered in parasites and bacteria in a place where those things can thrive. So these two things go in hand in hand and are super important. So if you are looking for beef, that is something to look for. Look for a farmer who is moving their animals often, and you need a little bit more land to be able to do that. You need a little setup, but that also requires a little bit more work. So it's a lot easier for a farmer to have all the animals in the same pasture, whether it is cemented or just bare dirt or a little bit of grass. And once they run out of the grass, just keep giving them hay. It's a little bit easier on the farmer to not have to walk out so far and change the fence every day or every couple days. But again, it is the way that the animals need to be living for maximum health. Okay, I think I've kind of talked about that, and I'm sure in the next two topics I will go over that again. But again, what you would want to be looking for if you're looking for your ideal source of beef is somebody who's moving their animals often, and giving them as much fresh grass as possible and limiting hay to what they absolutely need to feed. We feed hay in the winter months. We want to get to a place where we have managed our pastures so well that we don't even need to purchase hay. We are able to essentially bank hay in the ground, in the pasture, and have areas that have not been grazed heavily and have tall grass still available throughout the winter. So we're still just mimicking our summer rotation and moving the animals into those areas in the winter. We haven't done that yet, but we've taken out 2 new large pasture areas in the last year, and we're hoping to be able to do that this year or next year or as soon as we can. So the next thing I want to touch on is their life cycles, lifestyle. I don't really know what to call it, but I want to paint this scenario for you. So most cattle are, they're birthed by their mothers, and then they might get a couple months living with their mother, drinking her milk. When a cow is born, they are obviously nursing off of their mother, but they also can drink or eat grass and hay very, very quickly. So they don't have to nurse, although it is pretty important for them to kind of start off in a healthy way and to gain weight well to nurse. But different places will do it different amounts of time, but essentially that baby is going to be taken away from the mother so that the baby can be brought to a farm where it's going to be finished off and eventually sold for meat. So once it gets to that second farm from its mom, it's going to be living there as its main farm, and they're going to feed them till they get up to a weight where they're going to process them. This is a very standard model that almost all farmers use. There are definitely some farms like ours that have generational herds, and what that would mean is that the baby is not, we don't purchase babies. The baby stays with its mom until it's done nursing. Some farms wean them a little bit earlier for their own reasons, and we don't. We just let them, the moms and the babies figure it out. Typically the moms will, once they have another baby, tell that baby like, okay, you're done. I have to take care of this baby now. But they figure that out on their own. They know what they're doing. So I want you to consider how stressful that is for an animal to have grown to be, first off, an animal that needs its herd, right? We don't really understand what that might be like, but we do need people in society. But let's say you're a calf and you are 6 or 8 months old and you have grown up around your mom nursing the whole time. And you've also grown up around your maybe grandparents and your brothers and sisters and all of these other animals that you've kind of found your place in hierarchy with. And then you're removed and you're brought to a new farm where everybody's your age and you don't have a mom anymore, you're not nursing anymore, and you just have a couple months through the summer to live at this new farm, and then eventually you'll be processed. Consider the amount of stress that would put on an animal whose herd hierarchy really, really matters to them. And also who has just been around their family and all their friends and all their cousins and other relations and now is moved. Maybe on a spiritual level that doesn't matter to you. I would say it definitely matters to me. But in addition to that, we know there is a lot of science out there, and I'll try to stick this in the comments or the description. There are a lot of studies out there that show the amount of stress that the animal has within its body when it's processed does translate into the meat, and you're eating that. So in my mind, that's just not an ideal practice that we should move forward with, because again, it's just not very healthy. It's not healthy for the animal. I don't think it's very healthy for the farmer, because it really gets you in the mindset that this animal is dispensable. And I just don't really find it the best way to live, but I want to give you that information. You can make your own decisions. So the last thing I want to touch on, I'm going to try to keep this under 20 minutes, so I'm doing good actually, is processing. So I could talk about this in multiple videos, but I will just kind of go over the typical day for a cow's last day, and all of the different policies and factors that influence that. So typically when a large farmer processes cattle, they will load a bunch of them onto a trailer, drive them, whoever knows how far away. Ours are about an hour right now, but it could be farther, it could be closer, and they are unloaded at the processing facility. They might stand in a certain area for a long amount of time, because the processor obviously can only do so many animals at a time. So they might be standing outside, or where inside, maybe even worse, for a long amount of time, and they're seeing what's going on in front of them as the other cattle are dispatched and eventually processed. All of that is super stressful for an animal that has either been on a trailer once and that meant it went to a different farm, so that's a traumatic experience, or has never been on a trailer, never been transported in its life, and is kind of like, what am I on? Where am I going? I can't eat. It's a very traumatic, right, experience. But that is typically how animals are processed. And in our state, Illinois, where I live, there are very strict laws around processing on a farm, even just killing the animal on the farm and then bringing it to the processor, which would be a little bit better for sure. And I won't go into what all of those are, but basically it makes it really hard for the average consumer to purchase meat that has been processed on a farm by a licensed person who is licensed to process on a farm. So there's different levels of licensing. There are on-farm processors, but what they produce, even if they're licensed, is only allowed to be sold in certain situations in our in my state. So it really limits the farmer and the consumer to, if they are, conscious about this process and how their animal is processed, kind of limits your ability to get your hands on meat that's been processed in this more natural way. So in addition to the amount of stress that is, you also would want to consider exactly what your meat is washed in. Most meat, at least in my state, some organic processors will wash in a little bit cleaner wash, but not necessarily. The meat is, cut up and then dipped into a wash, and it probably has stuff in it that you would rather it not have. What I'm getting is that the processors feel very intimidated by the inspectors that are at their processing facility to use more harsher washes. They may have more natural options, but let's just say me, and maybe there's one other farmer that contacts our processor and says, I want this more natural wash. They may not want to fork over the amount of money to buy a new wash or change their process for the day, clean out all their tubs, and use this wash that just I want. So they may not say yes to that, and that's understandable. But I really hate the idea of raising our animals the way that we do with so limited chemicals, and then having to take them somewhere where they're going to be dipped in chlorine or citric acid or all of this other stuff that I don't want on my meat, and I'm sure that my customers don't want on their meat either. But the reality is, if you're buying meat from a store or even a farm that delivers, that their meat has been dunked in something that you probably don't want. So that stinks. The other side of this scenario is we do have an on-farm processor, and the last day of the cow looks a lot different. The processor comes to the farm. They walk all the way out. Thank you for doing that, because I know you roll your eyes for how far out our cattle are every time you come. They walk all the way out, or we drive them all the way out to where the cows normally are, so they don't, necessarily even, have to move at all. And they shoot them in the brain. And often the cows won't even no. I can tell you that the other cattle, I feel like it is probably a more cathartic process for them to see the 1 or 2 or 3 cows that are going to be harvested that day, actually get to see them die, right? And understand where this cow is going and why it's not coming back. When I first watched the process, I thought that they would probably freak out at the sound of a gunshot and seeing their friend laying on the ground. But they didn't. They kind of understood what was going on, and they sniffed at the cow and just kind of moved on with their day. And I would imagine that getting to see that versus just saying, I don't know why all my friends keep like being walked to this trailer and then, you know, they don't come back. I don't really know why that happens. That probably creates a little bit of stress for them. And again, not good for your meat. So that's a lot better process than for the cow, than the other process that I entailed. So I have been pretty busy the last couple of years, but before that I was working with some agencies in the state that are trying to have more mobile processors, because I'm sure you've also heard that since COVID, it's nearly impossible to get a processing spot. Farmers used to just call a couple of weeks ahead whenever they wanted to process a cow or any sort of livestock. But now you really have to have your dates over a year in advance. So if you do not call a year ahead of time and set your processing dates with the processor, you may not have them. And now you have cows that are ready to be processed, but you don't have a spot and they're getting really big and whatever else. So now we have that issue, and we really need more mobile processors, not just because I think it's a much more humane way for animals to be processed, but also because we're running out of processors, period, and that means a meat shortage. And we've definitely seen that in the last couple of years amongst at least farmers, local farmers, small farmers. So I think that is not 22 minutes, but I think that is what I wanted to cover today. I want to just give you a quick snapshot. I don't want to overwhelm you with information, but these are things just to think about as you are making big purchases for your family, as you're buying bulk beef, how the animals were raised. I know a lot of people, it's a lot of confusing information that you wouldn't necessarily know about their feed and about pastures and grass in the pastures and how tall they are, and rotational grazing, which means they move the animals to, they're rotating the grazing pastures. And there's some other names for that, but I won't go into all of those. So I hope it gives you a little bit of an idea as you're making these purchases and you're trying to educate yourself on the purchases that you're making. Hope it gives you a little bit of idea for what you might be looking for, what you might be interested in. And as always, if you have any questions, I can do my best to answer them for you. Just put them in the comments and I'll try to get back to you soon. And I hope this was helpful, and I will come on and do another video probably about poultry and fowl next. Have a nice day.